Hey creative weavers and crafters, in this video I'm going to show you how you can manipulate the warp threads of your weaving to create beautiful sprung lace. Sprung is an ancient technique of interlinking warp threads, and it's a great way to add a little section of open work to your next weaving project. I recently participated in a creative weaving challenge, and during that challenge I decided to add some sprung to my weaving. I'm fairly new to weaving, particularly on a rigid heddle loom, but I've been playing around with sprung for years. So naturally I wanted to add something that I was really knowledgeable and really passionate about to my creative weave. The more I did it, the more fun I had with it and the more ideas I came up with. So I decided to make this video so that other weavers would have the opportunity to have as much fun with their weaving by adding sprung lace to it. If you are new to sprung, I will be going over all of the moves that you're going to need to know in order to create the technique. However, if you're having any problems with it, I do have a free tutorial that teaches you everything you need to know to get started in sprung, and the link to that will be in the description below. I quickly want to go over the setup you're going to need for adding sprung to your weaving. I recommend that you start this on a weft dominant warp, so a warp that is less than 50% density. You can do this on a balanced warp. However, just be aware that it's not going to look the same as what I'm doing in the video, and it won't show the full structure of the sprung quite the same way as a weft dominant warp will. This is going to be a multi-part video because every time I sat down to my loom to work on another section of sprung, I came up with a whole bunch of new ideas as to how to incorporate sprung into weaving and make it look really cool and pretty. So I'm going to keep making videos as my weird creative little brain comes up with new ideas on how to incorporate it. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so this is pretty much just going to be a crash course in how sprung works. I just want to go over the basic concepts of sprung and the basic movements of sprung. So here I'm just going to show you that sprung is worked in rows just like weaving, so that's going to be an easy concept for you to understand. And we're going to be working the rows right to left, but you can actually work your rows left to right. So if you're left-handed and you have trouble with the right to left, go ahead and try left to right. All the instructions are the same no matter which direction you do it. So after every row, you have to insert a shed stick to keep your work in place. You're going to see in the video that I'm going to put 2 dowels into my work, and I'm going to push one to the top and one to the bottom. And that is because sprung works from both sides and grows towards the middle. And because we're going to be working on such a small section of our warp, you're pretty much just going to be working right in the middle. You're not going to be working at the top or the bottom. And again, you're going to see me pushing those dowels to the top and the bottom. And sprung works by interlinking threads together, and you want to make sure that they do interlink and that they don't just twist around each other, and I will show you how to make sure it works that way. So this is where we're going to get into the movements that you're going to need. We're going to be picking and dropping threads. So on this row that I'm showing the beginning of here, this is a basic row where you pick back thread and you bring it to the front, and you drop a front thread and push it to the back. You're going to do that all the way across the warp. You just pick a back thread and drop a front thread, and you can just continue doing that until you get to the end of the row. Now, if you were to make all your rows that way, you would end up with just the warp threads twining around each other, as you see in the bottom part of this picture, which actually would not be a terribly bad look on your warp. However, we're not going for that. We're going for interlinkings. So you alternate between that basic row of picking and dropping and this sort of shift row, and that is what I will call it, a shift row, where you pick 2 threads from the back to start your row and then you drop off a front thread. And then you continue across the row picking and dropping one thread until you get to the end, and you're going to do the opposite of that beginning movement. And this time you're going to pick one back thread and drop 2 front threads. So the shift row is you pick 2, drop 1. So pick 2 back threads, drop 1 front thread, pick 1 back thread, drop 1 front thread all the way across the row until you get to the end. And then it's pick 1 and drop 2. And then the basic row is just pick 1 thread and drop 1 thread. And then in this video, because we're going to be doing a little bit of a different pattern, you're also going to be picking 2 threads and dropping 2 threads. But the maneuver is really exactly the same. It's the picking a thread from the back and bringing it to the front, and dropping a thread from the front and pushing it to the back. And that is the basic movement that you need to understand in order to be able to do this sprung on your weaving. All right, so here I have my loom set up and ready to weave with sprung. So I put my heddle into the back neutral position so that all my threads are lying side by side. And I have also inserted 2 small dowels into the up shed. It doesn't matter which shed, the up shed's easier to put them into. And I have also loosened my warp tension, and don't loosen it too much, just enough to get your hands into the warp and easily manipulate those threads. So I'm going to be starting by doing a couple of rows of plain sprung, and I'm going to start by doing a shift row. And in a shift row, we're going to start by picking 2 threads and dropping 1. And you notice that I'm going to only work a small section of the warp at a time because our warp is so wide you could not get your hands all the way in the whole thing. And if you are working in a wide warp like I am here and needing to pick it up in sections, you're going to want to slide something into those sections to hold it in place. And here I am using my shuttle stick, and once I slide that in, I don't need to have my hands in that section anymore. If you do it this way, do be careful that when you go on to the next section, you pay attention to what was the last thread you did. Did you do a pick or a drop? I always end on a drop, partly because to me, pick and drop is the beginning and the end of the maneuver. But also I think it's just easier to remember that you end on a drop. And that way you know that when you go to start your next section, you always begin by picking up a back thread. Here when we get to the end, you'll see that I'm going to pick 1 thread and drop 2 because that will be what I have left, and it is the opposite of how we began this row. And then you'll see that I'm removing my dowels, my shed sticks after every row, and putting them into the new shed. And I put them into the new shed to hold that shed open for me because it's a little bit difficult to work the shed without the sticks sort of holding your interlinkings away from where you're working. You can do it, but it's better to do it on a looser warp, and we want fairly good tension on our warp for this. So one other thing that you can do is that you can use your shuttle or whatever you're using to hold your warp threads in place of your right hand. So rather than using your right hand to pick and drop your threads, you can use another shed stick or a shuttle or a crochet hook, or sometimes when I'm doing the middle, I use a Tunisian crochet hook because it's nice and long and it has that hook on the end. And I just wanted to show you here that you can do that. And I show you with my shuttle, but I'm not going to show you all the way across because I actually really don't like working the warp this way. I just don't have as good of control over the threads. But if for whatever reason this works better for you, I just wanted to show you that it was an option as a way to work your warp. And then do remember, this is a basic row, and that means that we are going to just pick and drop a thread all the way across. There will be no starting or ending the row with the picking or dropping of 2 threads. You're just going to pick 1 thread, drop 1 thread all the way until you get to the end of the row. Okay, so now that I've done 2 rows of plain sprung, I am going to start my lace pattern, and this is the simplest of, in my opinion, this is the simplest of the sort of lace open work patterns you can do in sprung, because you're essentially just making a series of holes all the way across your warp. And to make these holes, you're going to follow a 4-row pattern, and you're going to be picking and dropping 2 threads all the way across your warp. If you can, have a warp that is divisible by 4, but if you don't have a warp that is divisible by 4, then you can just do what I'm going to do here in this video, which is I'm just going to work a single set of, pick one, drop one at the end of my row. Okay, so this is going to be the first row of our 4-row pattern. And so we are going to pick 2 back threads and drop 2 front threads all the way across. So the only difference between this row and a normal basic row is that rather than picking 1 thread and dropping 1 thread, we're going to pick up 2 threads and then drop 2 threads. But otherwise, it's really pretty much the same as a normal basic row in that you just pick and drop. So just make sure that you remember to pick up 2 back threads and then drop 2 front threads. Now, because I did not make sure this was a warp that was divisible by 4, when I got to the end here, I'm left with 1 back thread and 1 front thread, and that's fine. I don't really mind that much. If I wanted this to be holes all the way across, I would have made sure it was divisible by 4, but I didn't, so that's okay. And I'm just going to go with it and have that those lone 1 thread at the end that I'm going to work as just plain sprung. So after taking my shed sticks out of the old shed and inserting them into my new shed here, we're going to move on to row number 2 of this pattern. And this is also a really simple row because this is just a normal basic row. And so all you're going to do is pick 1 and drop 1 all the way across the warp. Now, the actual what you're doing is very, very simple. Pick 1, drop 1, but do be very careful that you don't twist your threads, particularly the front threads. I don't know why, but for me, the front threads tend to twist more than the back threads. And what I mean by this is that you'll notice that these threads are sitting in sets of 2 in front of the shed stick and 2 behind the shed stick. And you want to make sure that those 2 threads that are sitting next to each other don't cross over each other. So just kind of gently pull the 2 threads apart before you pick 1 up and make sure that they come apart easily. Okay, so now moving on to row 3 of the pattern. And row 3 is going to be another row where you pick and drop 2. However, you're going to begin this row by picking and dropping 1 thread. And then you're going to move on to picking and dropping 2. And what you'll notice is if you had picked and dropped 2 threads, you would have picked the same 2 threads from the last set. And again, you notice how those sets of 2 threads are kind of laying together. We want to separate the 2 sets of threads. And so in order to do that, we start our row by picking 1 thread and dropping 1 thread. And then just go ahead and do your sets of 2s all the way across. And because I didn't do my my warp divisible by 4, and I had that sort of floating 2 threads at the end, I'm actually going to be able to do pick and drop 2 all the way to the end. However, if you had worked this on a warp that was divisible by 4, like you're supposed to, then when you got to the end, you would have another spare set of 2 threads, 1 at the back and 1 at the front, because you began your row by just picking and dropping 1. And so it's sort of like you split that set of 2 in half and left 2 at the front and 2 at the back. So it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't really matter. And then here, finally, we're going to work the 4th row of the pattern.
And this is actually just going to be a duplicate of row 2. So you're going to pick and drop 1 all the way across. And you can see that now that I have completed 3 rows, you can kind of start to see that nice open work pattern. I kind of think they look like teardrops, but they kind of tend to look different depending on the kind of tension you have on them and how much you're pulling them open. So sometimes they look like diamonds. Here they kind of look like teardrops. I just think they're kind of interesting and pretty looking, however you want to describe them. So you're just going to go ahead and pick and drop 1 all the way across. And that is the last pattern row. And so from here, you're just going to repeat. So you would go back after this row, you'll do a pick 2, drop 2 all the way across. And then after that, you will do another basic row of pick 1, drop 1. And then after that, you will do the sort of modified pick 2, drop 2 row where you start the row by picking and dropping 1 thread from the front and back. So pick 1 thread from the back, drop 1 thread from the front, and then do pick 2 threads from the back and drop 2 threads from the front all the way to the end. And then your final 4th row is pick 1, drop 1, just a basic row. So you'll get to kind of see what's happening as you go across. When you pick and drop 2, you have those tight little interlinkings, and then on the following row you kind of open them up a little bit, or you give them the opportunity to be opened up when you do that 3rd row. And it's really that 3rd row that's opening them up by splitting apart those sets of 2s. So I'm going to go ahead and work another set of pattern. I think I do 2 more sets of patterns on this. I don't remember, but since I'm recording my voice here after I actually did it, but I'm not going to show you all of that. Now that you've seen the 4 pattern rows, that's really all you need to know in order to work this pattern. And I'm going to jump back in when I get to the end, where I'm going to be manually weaving in that center area. Okay, so I did want to jump back in here and show you doing kind of squeezing in a last row kind of a situation here. And it can be difficult to get your hand in that narrow warp. So for one thing, notice that I only have 1 dowel in my shed. And just because having 2 dowels, there would not be enough room for you to fit your hand. So it's kind of a good idea to keep something in there in case you make a mistake. And so I left 1 dowel in. And then I'm slowly picking my way across this warp, because it's really easy to make mistakes and to accidentally drop something you didn't mean to drop here. So this is a good row if you want to try switching over to a crochet hook or a Tunisian crochet hook. So go ahead and try that. It'll be easier to slip that in than your right hand. You can replace your left hand with a shed stick. I personally have never gotten that to work without me feeling like I was just going to drop everything incorrectly. But you're welcome to try it, of course. I do, however, find that using a crochet hook or a Tunisian crochet hook in place of my right hand is a huge bonus when working in a narrow warp. And you'll see I kind of do funky little things like sliding my pinky in and other things like that to kind of minimize how much of my hand I have to get into that warp. So I don't really want to have to work in that little tiny warp any more than this. So I'm going to go ahead and start weaving now. And I've found from experience that picking up the manual shed is nearly impossible for me going from the left to the right. So I'm going to leave my dowel in there for as long as possible and use that as one of my sheds, and I'm going to use it as my left to right shed, as you will see here with me poking my little needle through. And then when I go back in the other direction, I am going to manually pick up my shed with this needle that I have here. So after I use my dowel for that first shed, I am going to leave the dowel in, and I'm going to just sort of manually go in and out of the next shed. So obviously manually weaving like this is going to be rather time consuming, but you have to put something into that final middle shed in order to secure your sprung. It will all just unravel if you don't have anything in there. Now, there is a way to do this without putting weaving in. It's the traditional way of doing it in sprung, which is to create a chain across the warp, which I may show in a later video. But because I'm adding this sprung to my weaving, I'm just gonna add weaving in there. And so it'll kind of look like I just continue, it was just these two sections of sprung that show up in my weaving, even though in reality, I had to add that weaving in between the two sections in order to secure them. And so I'm just gonna continue weaving one direction manually and the other direction using that dowel to keep my shed open for as long as I can. And then I will probably have to work the final 2 rows without the dowel in there at all and manually pick up both of them. And it really just depends on how tight you want your sprung as to how far up you go with your weaving. I like both sections of my sprung to look the same, but you could actually make one of your sections of sprung tighter than the other and kind of make it look like they don't look exactly the same. It's entirely up to you. Go ahead and play around with it and be creative with it. And if you're like me, you're probably going to get tired of having to manually work these rows of weaving. And so you might come up with some creative ideas on how to not have to manually weave those rows and make something look interesting in your sprung as well.
So now you know how to use the technique of sprung in your next weaving project to create a open work lacy section. In my next video, I'm going to show you how interlinking even more threads together will create an entirely new pattern. I will also show you what the piece of cloth that I've been working on looks like when I'm all finished with it and it's off the loom. So hopefully I will see you then.